one lousy foot and they call you a cannibal.
What is that from? I recognise that, and I can't remember.
The Big Bus.
Do you know, it's funny because you mentioned The Big Bus before, and I thought, until you mentioned it, I thought that literally is not a film I've thought about since it came out.
Yeah.
And, like, completely forgotten film, but I really liked it when it came out.
Yeah.
And then I was quite young when it came out. No, I forgot. I'll tell you what I really like the line, because it's just so meta-cinematic. If only you could see what I've seen with your eyes. The Blade Runner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That whole speech. Once I was doing the standard Trans 101 panel, and Bethany Black was also on the panel, and someone said, how do you feel about being a trans woman of a certain age who'd been around since the beginning, who transitioned decades ago? And I just went... I started doing that speech and then I faltered and Bethany picked it up on the beat. And then we just went, tears in rain, time to die. Oh God, actually one of my favourite Hollywood lines is it's a television line, and it's a Joss Whedon. It's from a Joss Whedon show. Julie Benz as Darla to the awful David Boreanaz as Angel. She goes, she's currently human rather than a vampire, and she's inside, but bad, and she's inside a church, and he can't get at her, and she just looks at him and says, "No matter how good a boy you are, God doesn't want you, but I still do." Which is essence of romantic Hollywood.
Yeah, like to the extent of camp, I would say.
Yes, exactly. But I mean, hey, nothing wrong with that.
Oh no, not at all. I can never remember lines.
Oh, of course, one of my favourite lines is not even a line really. It's just Garance. Yeah. Just that fine, that final shot where we just lose everyone in the crowd. I love that film.
I'd really love to see that again, because
I started off doing not so much film criticism as television criticism. I edited 3 collections of serious essays about television shows. Reading the Vampire Slayer, on Buffy and Angel, the reinvented Battlestar Galactica, and Ryan Murphy's Nip Tuck. I knew I was trying to come up with an overarching big idea, which is one of the reasons I got involved in doing that. And when I was working on my book about science fiction film, which has the title From Alien to the Matrix, which is not a title I like, because though it discusses the Alien films at great length, it doesn't discuss the Matrix very much. I sat down after I'd written the body of the book and realised that what I actually wanted to write about was a concept that I've called thick text. The idea that any work of art has a backstory, both in terms of its relationship with the genres it's part of, its relationship to the other works it might have been, the intervention of patronage, the intervention of studios. The way that most art goes through multiple drafts, the way that a lot of arts are overtly collective forms, in as much as films have a collective auteur. I mean, I'm very sceptical of the idea of the director, let alone the writer, as auteur. But yet there is authorship, but it's shared, and it's shared between a lot of people involved. I'm interested in writing about film and television, and indeed music and fiction. Painting I don't write about. I know I've talked about this to a friend who's a dance critic who goes, yeah, that's sort of true. That it's interesting to write about the 3 dimensions of the 4 dimensions of what we're looking at. That's at least what I'm interested in doing. And also one of the reasons for why I'm interested in doing that is because it's a democratizing project. It gets rid of the idea of there is serious art, which is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit, and there is commercial art, which isn't. The whole Adorno, Beethoven is great, but jazz is just commercial rubbish thing, because it's pans.
May I just ask, you said you write about the 4 dimensions of art. Could you just expound on what you mean by that?
The fact that I'm interested in, for example, it's the way that work either accepts or refuses expectation. It's the way that the purely contingent circumstances of a piece of art are as relevant to it as its internal structure. I mean, to give you an example I love, the fact that Bach's musical offering was partly, yes, a wonderful exploration of form and texture, but it was also a colossal 2 fingers to Frederick the Great for patronising him when he was visiting his son, who was Frederick the Great's composer. Because Frederick the Great, being very much part of the galant style of twiddly bits that dominated the mid-18th century, regarded Johann Sebastian Bach as a fusty old pedant who no one's interested in that sort of thing anymore, and patronised him horribly. And Bach sort of smiled sweetly and sent this incredible elaboration of fugues in multiple voices as a musical offering to the King of Prussia. And yes, it's a wonderful piece of work which fits in genre, but the thing that inspired it is also fascinating because there is this element of impudence in it, which, if you listen to it performed in a way that brings that out, enriches the experience. That's what I mean by multiple dimensions.
So you're interested not just in, if one can put it this way, the final object, but also all the
process,
stories and the stories behind it and the process that is built.
The multiple cuts, the fact that Sigourney Weaver got the backwards over her head basketball shot on the 3rd take, when everyone thought she only assumed I'll indulge her, but we're going to have to do that as a special effect because no one can do that. That sort of stuff, which in a sense is gossip, but also says some interesting stuff about the element of the spontaneous, the element of the improvisatory in art. I mean, the fact that Rutger Hauer made up the sort of Tears in Rain speech, which is one of the most memorable bits of that film, and it wasn't planned. The contribution of designers, composers, to the overall work. I think I don't want to overvalue any one aspect of a work. I mean, obviously, yes, a lot of the time the director or the writer is crucial. But at other times, there are so many mediocre films which are remembered not for the fairly clumsy contributions of the director or writer, but simply because the central performance is so stunning. Yeah. And I just wanted to find a language that dealt with that. And that was partly because, as someone who's a writer myself, I wanted to understand my own process.
Do you think that this kind of approach to say film is something that could have any viable platform other than a book?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. It was something, I was writing these books because I got the chance to write these books. I might write another book at some point when I'm finished with the current round of novels. It's an approach. It was something I wanted to put out there as an argument.
No, absolutely. And so, but I mean, obviously, this is I guess what you're talking about is a long form.
Yes,
approach to criticism.
a long form essay. I mean, what I want. I mean, if you look at the sort of essays on film that, say, Pauline Kael was doing in the New Yorker, long essay form. If anyone would ever commission me to write more of those, because I mean, From Alien to the Matrix and Teen Dreams are very much collections of essays, though there's an overall argument in both books. When I was offered the chance to write a book on science fiction film, one of the first things I said, well, I'm not writing a history. It's been done well. What I want to do is write a number of essays on individual films and themes and see what comes of it. So in a sense, long form, but long form in the sense of collection of rather shorter form pieces.
Would you say that the kind of approach that you're bringing to bear on these texts, if we can call them texts, would you say that that's something you miss in, say, contemporary journalism?
Not particularly. I mean, because a lot of... I think the reason people have been very kind about those books is because I just plugged into something in the zeitgeist. I think it was partly because various other theoretical approaches to film had reached their climax, and people wanted to do something else. I mean, as I say, Paris, France outside, the French outside Paris like me. I discovered when I went there.
The French outside Paris, but the French within Paris didn't. Is that
well, I mean, it's the sort of it's the provincial French universities that asked me to go and talk there. So I assume that Paris doesn't like me. I honestly don't know, because you go where you're asked.
It's a very general question in a way, but what do you think film criticism is for? Do you think that film criticism has a kind of like a function, or does it have?
It's about starting a dialogue with, on the one hand, filmmakers, and on the other hand, consumers of film. I mean, because of the internet, there is much more engagement on the part of people who watch than there ever was before. I think there always was that level of engagement, but it is now impossible to deny that there's that engagement. Yeah. This is why Adorno was wrong, because Adorno assumed that there is high art with which people engage and there is commercial pap with which people do not engage, they just consume in a passive way. That was always wrong, but it is now demonstrably wrong. And I think that's a zeitgeisty thing, and I think I don't regard myself as having done anything very original or special. I was just the right person in the right place at the right time to voice certain things.
I mean, you reject the model of high art versus commercial art, but I wonder, are you happy to apply that division to criticism itself? Do you think that there's high criticism and something else that's a little more...
There's well done criticism and there's less well done criticism.
What constitutes well done criticism?
Criticism, one that's memorable in itself outside of what it's discussing. Criticism that starts a dialogue, criticism that affects things. It's the difference between, in the long run, criticism that has a long-term consequence and that is readable. It's partly that it's criticism that is applicable to things other than the thing it's discussing. I would argue, for example, that there is a clear distinction between what Pauline Kael was doing, even in her shorter pieces, and what, say, someone like Christopher Tukey is doing when he was writing for the Mail, because he was just turning out the weekly article to order. It's the difference between Alex Walker and Ken Tynan. You can argue about that, because again, that itself, there is a metacritical argument to be had about which critics do the job in one way and which are just turning out weekly columns and purely reactively. As someone who has written considered pieces for various, mostly about books, sometimes about film and television, and occasionally has been on the 100-word capsule review stint, I know the difference. Though, which isn't to say when I'm writing a 100-word capsule, I don't try and make it as good and insightful as I can. But there are things you can't do. It's like... and in a way it's a decorum argument, that you probably need more than a couple of paragraphs to say something really useful about anything.
And it's interesting that you say that you think one of the values that the better criticism has is long-term. I think the phrase you used was long-term consequence.
Yeah.
Because to a degree this is subjective, but I would say that most of what we think of as film criticism is aiming for the exact opposite of that. Is purely for consumers of film before they see the film, and is entirely ephemeral. The point at which they've seen the film. It's consumer advice.
Yeah, but on the other hand, you could say that that something like Pauline Kael's New Yorker essays were for the most part intended to be read before people saw the film. But then they're reviews that you can go back to having seen the film. You can go back to time and time again after seeing the film time and time again and still find...
They'll enrich your reception.
They'll enrich your reception, even if you disagree with her massively, as I sometimes do. Because there's probably not a definitive response to anything.
Somewhere in the mix, I guess, of what film critics do, there's, especially if you're looking at newspapers and magazines and some blog sites, somewhere in the kind of the mix of what we're supposed to do is evaluation, determining whether a film is good or bad, or whether it's worth seeing or not worth seeing. I wonder how important a role you think that really plays in criticism.
I think it's one of those things. It's a function. It's very noticeable that a lot of reviewers will always get it wrong, that the formation of what we will, broadly speaking, call a canon partly comes from context. It's not that, say, that subgenre that consists of The Big Bus and The First Airplane Movie and Hot Shots are particularly good, but they, seen in the context of that period, they were doing something that other things came out of. It's the point, but it's also the point at which films create their own context and create the context in which they're re-seen. Because we are still watching films that were made 50 years ago, some of them. We are still judging things in the context of what we have post-determined is a genre, like noir. Yeah. Nobody said to John Huston when he made his version of the Maltese Falcon, "So, John, you're inventing the genre of noir film here. What do you think about that?" No, of course they didn't.
But that post-determination, of course, has an impact on
Yeah.
modern perception, reception. Right?
Yeah. And it's now, creates a relationship between films across a period of 50 years. And there is the fact that some films quote, other films retrospectively quote. Because obviously there are lines in films from the 30s and 40s which we now spot because other people have quoted them.
Right. Yes, like the sense when you watch Casablanca for the first time that you know every line.
Yeah. Every line in it is... Well, and the same, of course, is often said about Hamlet.
Yeah.
And yet Casablanca... I watched Casablanca in a cinema last year for the first time, I think, since I first saw it. Possibly the third time. I mean, I saw Casablanca for the first time in about 1971, 1972. And I've seen it endlessly on tape and DVD and television. But actually experiencing it in a cinema with someone who'd never seen it before and didn't know where the beats were was fascinating. Because you do get to suddenly hear those lines as if it was for the first time. And because it was a fresh... One of my favourite films is Valerie and Her Week of Wonders.
Yep.
But of course, for years and years and years, every time I saw it, I saw the same crappy copy that got more and more worn, because that was the copy that was going round the circuit, the art film circuit, endlessly. And that was the print that people made the DVD, the Redemption DVD from. And then last year, I bought the new DVD that's not made from that print. And it was a slightly different film because there were all these squiggles and bits of grot that I got completely used to. And now it was just... and the colours were crisper.
That improvement can really disrupt your sense of nostalgia.
Yes.
But, yeah.
No, it's just that what I'd seen was not just Valerie and Her Week of Wonders, it was that particular print of Valerie and Her Week of Wonders, which I suspect that copy of that particular copy had gone the art film circuit to the point where the version I saw in the Electric in 1972 and the version I saw at the NFT in about 1991, 20 years later, was exactly the same set of reels.
Probably in a more deteriorated condition. Yes.
I don't know this, but I strongly suspect it because, and certainly the Redemption DVD had exactly the same bits of grot on it. And that's the other thing I wanted to talk about. The way that we view films across time. I mean, and there is that element of familiarity and nostalgia is part of the jouissance of film. Sorry to say jouissance, but it is the word. We don't have an English word for it, God help us. Except I'm sure that gradually people will pronounce jouissance less and less accurately, and it will become an English word that people will spell differently, like courgettes. One of the things I valued so much in my 20s when I was reading her very heavily was the way that Cale gets the sheer pleasure of watching things a lot of the time. Even when she does, I mean, obviously there are things she doesn't enjoy. I mean, there are directors that Cale didn't get. I think creators often instinctually do these things. That there is a sort of dialogue across time. Oh, I will do that, but I will do it better. Or I will do this new thing because I am totally bored with people doing that thing. But the act of refusal sometimes has its own weird echoes of what went before. I'm trying to think of a good example of that. It's the way that I think you can argue with hindsight that a lot of, say, early Godard is just as artificial as Renoir. I mean, and a lot of the time when we kill the parent, we're actually also expressing the fact we care about the parent.
So do you mean in the sense that if you depart from a tradition, you're acknowledging the tradition as well?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And often that will lead in turn to a reconciliation with the parent. I mean, it's the way that a lot of the directors of the British kitchen sink angry young person school were back making lush historical dramas within 5 or 10 years. That there was this whole rejection, in a sense, of the Archers, of Powell and Pressburger. And yet, what comes out of what a lot of the directors who made the kitchen sink films went on to make things that are absolutely in the spirit of the Archers, that have the really strong colour values, the delight in melodrama. I think it's not that some people see this as selling out. Often it's just coming to terms.
This is going to seem like going from the sublime to the ridiculous, but the title of the documentary is No Stars, and there's an obligatory question about star ratings and whether you have a view on star ratings, whether you think they have any benefit at all or no benefit at all. What therefore, given that they're such an omnipresent part of the landscape now?
There's such a horrible oversimplification, because there are plenty of films that I would give, in a sense, if I was making a final judgment on them, very, very low ratings to, that I'd still tell people, go and see it for this reason. I'll give you an example. The films of Tarsum Singh.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, his Mirror Mirror.
Which I haven't seen, but
But I mean, his take on the Snow White film. It's a mess. It's all over the place. Julia Roberts does the Queen as this sort of arch diva that doesn't belong in the same film as some of the sequences. There's a sequence where she attacks Snow White and the dwarves with a puppet. That she has a puppet that she's manipulating, and in the forest, this giant version of the puppet starts attacking them until Snow White works out it's a puppet and cuts its strings. And visually, it's so startling and such a strong image. It's a rotten film, but there are bits in it that are gorgeous. Snow White and the Huntsman, to talk about Snow White films, is a pretty ropey film, but Charlize Theron's performance is everything that Julia Roberts wasn't. It's hot and sexy and powerful and terrifying. Yes, it's a terrible film. I mean, I'm told Kristen Stewart has been good in things, but she's not good in that. And that's the trouble with star ratings, they miss nuance.
Do you think that they have any value at all?
Yeah, I mean, that if you're riffling through the newspaper on a Saturday night trying to make up your mind, they probably help. And that's not an ignoble thing, but you should probably read the piece.
Yeah. It's funny, it's said, I don't know how true this is, but it is said that there is a far greater chance of the piece getting read if there's a star rating attached to it than there isn't, apparently. I don't know how you collate this kind of statistic, but although that said, it also depends on what, if a film has 1 or 5, the piece will get read. But 3, where personally I kind of think is where most interesting stuff happens in cinema, is the films that are sort of they're not great, but they're not terrible. Mm-hmm. That's often I think where culture comes out to play, and those kinds of reviews will be disregarded because someone sees a 3-star rating, they think meh, and that's as far as they get.
Yeah, but 3-star doesn't mean meh; it means flawed.
And flawed is always interesting.
Yeah, and flawed is liable to reassessment. I mean, there are lots of things which didn't get very good reviews when they came out that we now think of as important films. Blade Runner. Yeah. In whatever of its versions. I thought it was ace from the day I first saw it.
I did too, although I think I was 11.
Yeah.
But,
yeah, I once wrote a piece about that sort of future noir, which started, "It was the future, it was raining." Because that had an incredible influence. It actually had an incredible influence on books that came out after it.
Do you think that star ratings are more for the benefit of the reader or for the benefit of the distributor?
I think they're for the benefit of the editor.
Of the particular publication?
Yeah. But yes, I mean, I'm sure that in terms of the distributor, they give them something to take to their board, but heaven help us, that's often a disaster. I mean, the loss, one of the great besetting problems of our time is the loss of expertise among hawkspit managers and hawkspit financial managers. There is a refusal to actually do the work and understand flavour on the part of a lot of the people who are making decisions. And that's why one of the things that's working to destroy the culture.
And that's where lazy shorthands like star ratings, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, so I think they're not bad in themselves. They're potentially a symptom of something awful.
Right. Okay, well, that's very clear. Okay, well, sort of.
But then I would say that, wouldn't I?
Well, I mean, you're preaching to the converted, believe me. So it's
yeah.
But maybe changing the subject a little bit, talking about the way that media landscapes have changed. I wonder, since you started your work in film criticism, what kind of changes have you seen taking place? And are they superficial changes or are they real changes?
I think they're real changes. A greater preparedness to say that the emperor might not have any clothes on. A greater preparedness to be rude. A greater preparedness to say this director has lost their way. And that's partly the influence of, heaven help us, Twitter. And there are worrying aspects to that. There's a tendency to rush to judgment. The number of times that people start making their decisions about a film on the basis not of having seen it, but of having seen the trailer. And that's had a consequence in its turn, which is that occasionally really savvy filmmakers can build that in. I mean, the obvious example is the third Iron Man movie, where Marvel trolled the entire internet. I mean, you remember the way that before people saw what Iron Man 3 did with the Mandarin, every self-righteous person, a lot of people on the internet got very, very upset that they'd made an Iron Man movie which was about the Mandarin because Orientalism. And actually, it was what Shane Black had done was a deliberate tease of that. And Marvel did the very canny thing of letting the storm and the quite negative comment ride, and then going, aha, but that's not what we did at all. You just assumed that was what we did. That's an interesting thing, that because of internet culture, because of people's tendency to shoot from the hip and judge, it's potentially worrying. And I mean, I know a lot of people who do this, who jump to conclusions about what they're going to see. Now, that was always true to some extent, but I think internet culture has speeded that up.
Yeah, I was going to say, anticipation in a sense, it's human nature to anticipate, but there's something about the way in which the internet functions which fosters a focus on anticipation, which often actually is far more intense than any focus on the...
But it's often sort of, it's I mean, I haven't yet seen Ant-Man, I confess. I mean, I might go and see it later in the week. It was, a lot of journalists thought, there is a piece to write about how Marvel has lost its way, how Marvel's finally got a flop. And a lot of people who wrote that piece 3 or 4 years ago, and then last year, and there is clearly the piece to be written on how Marvel has reached a point now where it can afford the odd flop. But actually Iron Man wasn't particularly that flop. It was better than some, not as good as others. And that can kill a movie. It also enables the internal politics of film companies to escape into the wild and do tremendous damage to mediocre films that weren't that bad and had something to recommend them. I'm thinking of the John Carter effect. The fact of the matter was, John Carter is not a great film. John Carter is not a colossally bad film. One of the reasons why it flopped was that people had made all sorts of internal wibbles about what to call it, and other people had been trying to undermine the people who were responsible for it. And so the word got out, oh, this is a terrible movie that's going to completely flop. And so it did flop, because people stayed away in droves because they'd been told they would. And that's all a bit worrying, because that could happen to something far better. I mean, if you think about all the fuss about Brazil, these days the studio could have killed Brazil. You know, that Terry Gilliam would have had to be very, very smart to avoid the studio just trashing trashing Brazil in advance to a point where the well was poisoned forever.
Although that said, I don't think he had an easy time on it.
Pardon?
I don't think he had an easy time on it.
No, he had a pretty bad time, but but it would, if you think.
No, I understand what you
Similarly, I mean, and again, this is a deeply flawed movie that I think is Heaven's Gate. I mean, can you imagine what the studio would have said about the people in the studio that wanted to get rid of Heaven's Gate would have said about Heaven's Gate at the time?
And the fact is that if you're a journalist now online, so not a print journalist, but strictly an online journalist,
you can be very irresponsible.
A so-called news story about the costume that perhaps a superhero may be wearing in a film that won't come out for 2 years.
Yeah.
Has more value than a review of that film after it does come out.
Yeah.
And just in terms of clicks, in terms of getting attention towards whichever site you're writing for. And I wonder whether this kind of decentering of the film itself from the conversation about film, which is, I think, something new. I wonder whether you think this is just a thing and a thing.
I think it's a thing, and but it's worse. It's the bad thing that the brother-in-law of the lighting engineer may have done in an entirely other context is part of the story of the film. You should not go and see Avatar 3 because James Cameron's brother drove when drunk.
Right. Is this actually? May I ask? Is this? I mean, I don't want to be too superficial about something that you said earlier, and I realise this is a slightly superficial response. But is this something like? Does this fit into what you were referring to?
It could do, but I mean, I see what you mean, and I think the answer is there are things which are actually nothing to do with the artistic project.
So
I mean, yeah. It is interesting. It is only interesting what costume people might have worn if they didn't wear the costume they eventually wore. In retrospect, it is not interesting in advance.
Whereas now the focus is always in advance.
Yeah,
the conversation is taking place before the film has emerged.
Yeah. And that's something out of which we will have to grow.
I wonder though also whether it's relevant to the documentary, so maybe. But I wonder whether this also says something about the change in viewing practices, in that I think viewers actually enjoy anticipating much more than they enjoy watching films. But,
sometimes, yes.
And I think they're more and more we're primed.
But I mean, the point is I actually enjoy, I don't know about you, I enjoy anticipation when I don't know very much. I didn't particularly want to know what John Carter, what Barsoom looked like in John Carter, till I was actually watching it in a cinema, because I wanted it to look like the Barsoom of my dreams, and it did. And I didn't want to know if it didn't, because that would have meant I didn't go and see it. And it's the same with Tomorrowland. I mean, I'd seen a little too much of Tomorrowland, which meant that was the one big selling point Tomorrowland had, was
its look. Yeah.
The look.
Yeah.
And actually, I went and saw it, but I was already grumpy with it. And and there were plenty of reasons to be grumpy about that movie. Let's not. And I knew George Clooney, and that's the thing. There are expectations that you know you're not going to get away from. Like these days, if you see a movie with George Clooney in it, he will twinkle at you.
I think what I liked about Tomorrowland, I mean, I didn't love it. I think
it's not a disaster.
Into the model of the kind of the flawed film.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting flawed film, and what I liked about it was the way it insured itself against the viewer's cynicism by being kind of about viewer's cynicism.
Yes, exactly.
It said, well, if you think that this is all sentimental hokum, well,
that's your problem, and it's probably going to destroy the world.
Yeah, and I thought that was very interesting. But
yeah, I mean that was, and you thought, has it actually earned that perception? I'm not sure it has, but there were things about it. The young woman who played the robot, isn't she amazing?
I didn't review the film, and I didn't take notes on it. I can't remember who it was.
Yeah, I can't remember her name because I wasn't reviewing.
Yeah.
But I mean, both. I mean, yeah, and they wasted Hugh Laurie. They absolutely wasted Hugh Laurie. Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned Twitter, and if we can look at new media, I mean,
Yeah.
digital media and online media, do you think that they have some what positive contribution do they have to make?
Positive contribution? I mean, I'm thinking of. I mean, I mostly don't tweet about film and television. Or books.
Is there a reason? Is that a policy, or is that just something?
It's a self-denying ordinance, okay. Because I think it can lead to very superficial things. Except that when I really liked something, I will tweet it because it's just such. I mean, I will often tweet in real time while I'm watching a television show because I love a line, like. I may not be quoting it accurately, but when we meet in season 3 of Hannibal, when we meet Alana Bloom again, and she has survived, but he's on a stick, and she says in a blasé way, "I never thought I'd get to use the word defenestration in casual conversation." That's a great line. That's the tweet.
You want to share the love.
Yeah. Especially when you don't attribute it. And so, who says that?
So, what, are you suggesting that you like... So, the way you use Twitter is for its postmodern capacity?
Yeah, you can just do
fragments of
bricolage. Yeah. I mean, and the point is you don't have to watch Hannibal to think that's a great line. Though... far too few people watched Hannibal, which is a great shame, because that's why it's been cancelled. Well, you will do.
I will, but I haven't yet.
I mean, because it is the art film sitcom about serial killing and cannibalism. But, yes, people use it to shoot from the hip in a super... I mean, I would rather be applying... my anger, because Twitter is very good at anger and sarcasm, and I'd rather you save that for the political world.
Right. Okay. Leaving Twitter aside for the moment, there's also, of course, it's never been easier for any individual to publish anything of any length than it is today.
Exactly, and that's amazing, and. I should do it more, but I've got I'm writing other things. But it is amazing that you can read these really intense and intelligent pieces. And that's often a corrective, and they're often a useful corrective to what's being said. Often also online, in newspapers, because some of the best critical reactions to Sense8 have come not from paid bloggers, but from people who just really liked it and wanted to explain why people were wrong about it and why it was good. And that's been a fascinating, because that's a show that there's been a genuine argument about between people who think correctly that it's a bit clunky and people who say, yes, but it's so good that the occasional clunkiness doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter for a number of reasons. One of them is the normalisation of various queer identities that don't normally appear on television. And people saying, oh, well, it's appropriative. And people saying, yeah, and it's an American television show that's in part about a Nairobi bus driver. And how many shows are there about Nairobi bus drivers on American television? And there is an interesting argument going on, and that's the thing I do like about social media and the internet and film criticism, is that again often in long forms, there are genuine interesting arguments going on.
So do you think that there's anything that hold on, let me think how to phrase this. Should the views of a professional, by professional I mean paid very specifically, should the views of a professional critic be inherently valued more than the views of an amateur critic? And if not, is there any basis for the authority of a
Well, people don't get their authority by being paid, though people with authority often are paid. People earn authority at every stage, and people can lose that authority by being rubbish. Julie Burchill. Johann Hari. It is possible to discredit yourself by being stupid or wrong, stupid, evil, or wrong. And it is possible to gain a level of authority by being good and by being right. Because at the end of the day, people will walk away or be very, very rude. And that's the thing that, on the one hand, don't read the comments, and on the other hand, it does make the whole process it's not deprofessionalised journalism or reviewing, but it's made journalism and reviewing more directly accountable, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, back when Avatar came out, I listened to and agreed with a lot of the hostile criticism of Avatar, while actually liking it and actually thinking it could be defended in a lot of those terms. And yes, I mean, I wrote the piece defending Avatar knowing that a lot of people were going to yell at me.
It's funny though, with that particular film, and this is kind of apropos of nothing, but with that particular film, I know from my own personal experience of it that sometimes when you look at something you write about a film, you don't really recognise yourself because you've changed. And I wrote a piece whose positivity towards the film when it came out constantly surprises me, because I guess I know, and I have a historical record of it, that I really liked the film when it came out. And I don't really ever think about the film now.
Yeah, well, the thing is that we won't think about it again until parts 2, 3 and 4 come out, because there's a sense in which, because now we know what I always thought. I always assumed it was the first part of something, and that the great scheme was always that there be more parts, and that any judgment one had of what it was saying was going to be provisional for that reason. I mean, I may well have been completely wrong, but I always assumed that it was the first episode of a trilogy, though in fact it's the first of a quartet. I always assumed that it would be revealed in later films that Na'vi were not, quote, primitives, they were post-technical. That entire environment was designed. That the floating islands were a planetary defence system as the Earth fleet that comes to nuke the place to crap. We'll find out the hard way when those floating islands shoot into space and hit it. Which is, of course, a steal from the Verhoeven Starship Troopers. Because, as we know, James Cameron steals from everything that's not nailed down and much that is. I could be completely wrong about all of this. But my money is that I'm not about all of it. Well, and the fact that Sigourney Weaver is in the other movies means that I'm clearly right to go that sort of that whole this tree that stores people's minds. Yeah, that's a product of ordinary evolution, isn't it? I mean, and sometimes things are more excluded than they used to be. I mean, a lot of the really interesting films that were coming out of Africa 20 years ago haven't had a successor. And that's worrying. But on the other hand, African commercial cinema is doing hugely well. The Nigerian film industry is, I'm told, amazingly prolific. It's just stopped, but it's not.
It's self-contained.
It's self-contained. It doesn't escape outwards, and it's not got that seriousness. Not that seriousness is necessarily a good thing in itself, but that guy from Benin, or was it Guinea-Bissau? Idris Udreagu, who was making some really interesting films 25 years ago, and hasn't been heard of since. And where did that go? And it's the way that Indian cinema obviously has this wonderful, rich industry, but it's not. Bollywood is not producing a successor to Satyajit Ray, and Satyajit Ray was the culmination of decades of Indian cinema in multiple languages. That is not a heritage that Bollywood is preserving. I mean, I've been hearing a lot of awful stories about how the Indian film of the 20s and 30s and 40s is just being left to rot in corridors because no one's doing the conservation work except for a few people who are doing it for love. And no one's funding conservation work. So it's a perpetual struggle to keep marginalised voices going. And sometimes, one step forward, two steps back, or two steps forward, one step back.
But I might add, I'm expressing this very awkwardly because I'm really asking a personal question.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
But I'm asking, have you yourself? I mean, not just marginal materials, but marginal voices.
Yes. Well, I mean, I am conscious of having been, in some respects, quite lucky, and in other respects, just as unlucky as you'd expect. I mean, the fact, as everyone has been remarking over the last couple of months, that my novel Tiny Pieces of Skull did not get published when it was written in 1988, but was in fact being published 27 years later, because it's a trans novel about sex work that's not a misery memoir. It's kind of, oh well, this thing happened and that thing happened, and that's all quite interesting. But on the other hand, it's out now, and it's out in the context, but it's come out in the context of those voices being less marginal than they were. Constant vigilance, I guess. Obviously, the fact that there is now a major Hollywood director and writer who's trans is a function of the person, Lana Wachowski. The colossal pain that must have cost her in not transitioning when she was younger, because you can bet she wouldn't have got where she is if she transitioned when she was 20.
But do you think that now is the time? I mean, in the sense
now is the time.
Is a much better time.
Now is a much better time, but there are plenty of voices that are still massively excluded. I mean, inevitably. I mean, now is the time for, to stick with just trans stuff. Now is the time for white middle-class trans people. It is not the time for working and underclass trans people of colour.
Right. Okay.
It's in. I mean, I'm afraid it's all to do with intersectionality. The more things you've got going against you, the more likely you are to be excluded.
And also, this is I'm aware in asking this question that I'm repeating presenting the problem that I'm asking about.
Yeah.
But I wonder whether whether it's been your experience that you found because of your identity that editors push you into certain pigeonholes when it comes to writing. Like you'll be given this kind of film.
Oddly less, but that's partly because. Weirdly, I think the problem has been that I ended up, when I did write about film occasionally, writing for places like the Times Literary Supplement, where I wrote about a lot of things. Yeah. I think the answer is because, I mean, there's a whole bunch of happenstantial autobiographical detail here. I was marginalised in the LGBT press because trans, and because of the hostility towards trans people in the LGBT community in the 80s, which meant that I ended up, in as much as I've ever made it, making it in bits of the mainstream press, and specifically, of all places, the Times Literary Supplement. And the TLS is odd because its general complexion is somewhat right of centre, but it's always had a small quantity of licensed left of centre material. There are a bunch of people who write for the TLS a lot who do not have the same politics as its editor. And I mean, if you look down the years at the people who've been editor of the TLS, Ferdy Mount, Pete Stoddard. I mean, Pete Stoddard came to edit the TLS from being editor of the Times. Ferdy Mount from running Thatcher's policy unit. And yet both Ferdy Mount and Pete Stoddard have been wonderful editors for those people like me and Robert Irwin and Tariq, who do not have the politics that go with that. So there was that, and that's meant that in as much as I got pigeonholed at the TLS, I'd be asked to review slightly quirkier fiction than a lot of people, because that was what I was interested in reviewing. Yeah. So I got to write about, I won't say the American avant-garde, but certainly a lot of less obvious American voices. Similarly, I mean, I got to write all those, I get to write on things like skinheads and air stewardesses. Because, I'm that person. So when I got to write about films, yes, I mean, I did write one piece about saying basically that if you're going to see a good trans film, go and see Breakfast on Pluto more than Transamerica, because it's a better movie, and actually less obviously researched, but better on the feel of it, which I do think. Very much better than the book is. I mean, Breakfast on Pluto, the book, is really quite transphobic in a way that the film is really very positive. It's very, given the close collaboration between Jordan and McGrath, that's quite interesting that Jordan actually, having filmed The Butcher's Boy very faithfully, when he came to film Breakfast on Pluto, basically threw large parts of the book away and actually made an entirely different movie. Whereas Transamerica is so fucking worthy.
Cillian Murphy has never been better, than in Breakfast on Pluto.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's very interesting because it was spooky, actually, because I was around Soho in that period. My flatmate and best friend was a Northern Irish trans woman, though a prod rather than a Catholic. So it was particularly spooky because Cillian Murphy, who I've checked, has never met Matt. But nonetheless, it was just very... Have you ever seen Soldier's Girl?
No.
That's very spooky because Lee Pace, who's playing Calpurnia Adams. Now, I've met Calpurnia a few times, and that that performance is spookily accurate. I mean, Lee Pace looks nothing like Calpurnia, but just captures every tick. Has clearly just watched her. But so there's that. And similarly, I never let myself be the TLS's science fiction person or the TLS's trans person without, and yet from time to time, if asked, I would review something relevant. It's that whole very careful thing of not letting yourself be pigeonholed. And that's why I was quite lucky. I've been quite lucky with The Guardian, that though I will write about LGBT stuff and trans stuff for The Guardian, because I had people who liked my work getting me to write about religion and getting to write about religious art, I had this other thing I could do. And I think that's something it's very important not to let you, to resist being, on the one hand, pigeonholed, and on the other hand, resist running away from the things you know about. And it's a very fine balance to strike. And I mean, I think because I was doing all of this stuff back when I was first doing it, I had to do consciously what a lot of people would probably otherwise have done instinctively, but because I was blazing certain trails. But I'm fascinated to watch the way that Juliet Jacques has very much, having done her trans stuff, is now writing much more about football and avant-garde art than she was before. Yeah. Because she doesn't want to get pigeonholed. Because why would she? She's done the book. It's going to be very interesting seeing how all of that plays out. And I mean, I was much more prepared to be pigeonholed as a genre person. But again, I didn't want to be. That's one of the reasons I wrote Teen Dreams, was because I didn't want to be pigeonholed as a science fiction and fantasy person. I wanted to be someone who wrote about genre. Genre in a more general sense. Yeah, and obviously it was also an obvious thing to write after writing about Buffy. Yeah. But Nip Tuck was. I was interested. I'm just very interested in Ryan Murphy, though he's a deeply flawed and irritating creator.
I have to admit at this point, I have never watched Nip Tuck. So, is he the series creator?
He was the showrunner. Nip Tuck. Okay, Ryan Murphy is the guy who did a teen show called Popular, who did.
Which I do know actually.
Who did Nip Tuck?
Yeah.
Who did Glee, and who does American Horror Story. So he's fascinating from a. He's someone who. He's very interesting. And Nip Tuck was a sort of gothic. It's an American gothic medical show. Because it's a deeply sardonic show about plastic surgery and the American dream, in which there are no sympathetic characters. He really does despise almost all of his characters quite deeply. And yet they're also clearly, in some important ways, him. It's a very interesting show. I mean, it's at its best. It was, and it did the thing that Buffy did, which is the imperfect interlacing of metaphor and plot. So, for example, at a point when the two plastic surgeons have had a really big fight and are trying to sever their professional relationship, they are committed to doing the restorative work after the separation of conjoined twins.
Yeah, I see where you're going.
Now, we are not talking a deeply subtle show, but the conjoined twins episode is a particularly fine example of what that show could do at its best. I'm fascinated by flawed things. I suppose is the other thing. one of the everyone writes about masterpieces. I want to write about what's glorious about things that aren't masterpieces but are interesting in a way that.
I totally agree with you. So personally, that is what
Yeah.
I'm much rather like as well. But
Because how often, it's an awful lot of things are seen as masterpieces when they come out that are totally forgotten.
I don't like sticking the knife into things because I just think it's a waste of time, and
Yeah.
I don't trust my own gushing. I
Yeah.
think once you enter a mode of gushing about how fantastic something is, it has its own momentum,
Yeah.
and you end up not saying anything.
My
And,
instinct is that Ozon will turn out to have been a much more important director than people currently give him credit for. But I'm not sure of that. I just think that things like Swimming Pool, 8 Women, are really interesting films. The New Girlfriend. But it's also, he's not a director it's easy to pigeonhole or put a finger on because everything is totally. Oh, crumbs, I can't remember the title of that very lush, very Powell and Pressburger movie of the Elizabeth Taylor novel about the romantic novelist that came out 2 or 3 years ago.
I don't think I know the one you mean.
It's set in it's sort of Edwardian going through 20s novel about this terribly darling.
I don't think I know the one you mean, but
but it's shot in it's very Michael Powell palette. It's like really thick purple velvets. And that and the swimming pool, which most of the reviews just complete. Did you not see that?
I loved Swimming Pool.
It's wonderful, but it's the way that an awful lot of reviews didn't get that much of what happens in her head because she's writing the novel. It's right. She's writing different versions of the novel. And it's such an inventive film, and a lot of this thing is.
It's like Barton Fink, but set by Paul.
Yeah, it's like Barton Fink, but good.
Oh, I really like Barton Fink.
I like Barton Fink, but Barton Fink. Barton Fink is not good in the same way. Barton Fink is daring and inventive, but doesn't have that feeling of ease that the Swimming Pool has. And it's also that Charlotte Rampling is so good in it. Yeah. She can be so good, and she can be so god-awful bad. That's why I like doing this stuff, because you get to be enthusiastic about things, and if you can't be enthusiastic about what you're doing, what's the point of it? One of my weaknesses as a critic is that I talk a good fuck about sort of treating everyone with respect, but I don't understand, say, cinematography all that well. I have a sense of the pictorial look of things, but I tend to see cinematography through a vein of other cinematographers or art. I don't understand the editing process all that well. I can sort of see the difference between a tracking shot and a sudden cut and things like that, but I don't. It's instinctual. If I were going to start from scratch and train myself up to be the person I'd like to be as a film critic, I would actually go and talk to people a lot more and get them to tell me about stuff much more. I don't understand the financial process of film. Actors I sort of get because I've hung out with actors.
Do you think it's important though?
Oh, I think actors are important because...
the financial aspect.
The financial...
Or to understand those things like cinematography and everything.
Yeah. In an ideal world, it would be, one should understand everything.
Sure.
And I am not that person, because I came to film reviewing, writing about film, as opposed to just going to the movies and reading a fair amount of film criticism because I enjoyed it. It wasn't part of the plan. I mean, bit of autobiography, I worked in television for a bit in my 20s, and went on. I was working at Yorkshire Television, but lost my job because of the 3-day week. I went on doing a certain amount of television-related work in as much as, having been the script reader at Yorkshire Television, I went on being a freelance script reader at the BBC. And a number of things I wrote reports on got made, so I must have been quite good at it. I mean, I wrote the report that got used to persuade people to make Testament of Youth. So,
yeah, big deal.
I'm quite good at what I do in that respect. It was like, as a publisher's reader, I discovered Hilary Mantel. So there's that. But I was someone who wrote about books and who worked in publishing as a freelance. And in the course of the 80s and 90s, I got more and more involved in certain sorts of politics. I was involved in queer politics generally, and I got involved specifically with anti-censorship politics. I was one of the people who co-founded Feminists Against Censorship. That led to me spending the 90s being deputy chair of Liberty and engaged in the struggle to stop the Blairites drawing the teeth of NGOs before they were elected as the government. At the end of the 90s, my health, part because of overwork and strain and stress, my health collapsed and I was very, very ill. And I realised I had to change my life and do something else. And I decided what I would do would be write something about Buffy, because I was watching it a lot. And this entire thing of me being someone who thinks about and writes about film and television is a product of me deciding to do something new when I turned 50 and had poor health. So I didn't prepare. I mean, I am conscious that really to be the film critic I would like to be, I would need to have spent my entire life preparing for it in a way I really didn't.
Okay, well, personally, I think this is really interesting because it makes you very different from everybody else we've interviewed, because everyone has come to it because they love film when they were kids and watched films endlessly when they were kids. And yet, to my ears, you have a far more conscientious approach to criticism than anyone we've interviewed. So,
but it's not what I do, it's what I think I ought to do, be capable of doing, and I do regard myself as essentially an amateur by the side of someone like Anne Bilson.
But we haven't been able to interview Anne Bilson because she's involved.
But isn't she coming of Kim?
But we can't do it then, so it's
right.
No, she's around. I mean, well, no, sure. Yeah, I don't know. I have to think about it. It's partly to do with timing because I don't live in London, right? So it's
yeah. But yes, I mean, I regard myself as a slapdash amateur by the side of a lot of other people, but that's because I take things very seriously. And in fact, I mean, I haven't done anything for a while because I've been busy with fiction and poetry.
But that's fine.
I mean, there is a book I was supposed to be writing about fantasy film, which hit the doldrums because I sold it to IB Taurus on the basis of a proposal. About a year after I'd sold it, they came back and said, the American distributor have decided they don't like that proposal. Could you produce a new proposal? So I shifted all the emphases of the book in a new proposal. And they said, that's fine. And then about A while later, and I mean, I'd been doing things like the nip-tuck book, and a while later, they came back again and said, they're still not totally happy. I said, well, what's their problem? And they said, we don't know. So I said, well, maybe you should find out. And I said, the way my schedule works, I can write the book in the second half of 2014. But I can't do it before that or after it for a while, for quite a long while. And so you need to let me know. And they never did.
Yeah.
And I mean, they haven't chased me for the book. They haven't chased me for the money. And the whole project has died on me anyway.
Yeah.
Partly because, of course, The Hobbit is such crap. I mean, because I thought, oh, well, at least I'm going to be able to write about The Hobbit. Oh, dear.
Yeah.